get the show started. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining. Welcome to In Rhythm Lightning Talks. I'm your host, Parag Katkar. I'm the head of consulting practices at In Rhythm, and we have several awesome lightning talks lined up for you in the upcoming weeks. So our lightning talks are hosted every Thursday at 5:15 p.m. Eastern Time, and each week, one of our practice area consultants shares their knowledge on the evolving technology trends in the industry that will help you keep learning and growing in your career. So this week, Vanessa and Ray, who are senior software engineers with us, are going to give an overview of accessibility, which is an extension of usability. It's a discipline that aims to help people achieve their goals by being inclusive and removing barriers to achieve equity. Ray and Vanessa are going to show how through empathy and technical implementation, we can create an accessible experience that benefits everyone. And I've been waiting for this talk for a long, long time. So without further ado, let's get it started, Vanessa and Ray.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Ray, and welcome to our lightning talk, What is Accessibility? First, I'll give a brief overview. Then Vanessa will delve into a technical example, and we'll be sharing our slides, resources, and tools so note-taking can be kept to a minimum if desired, and away we go. So a definition of accessibility addresses discriminatory aspects related to equivalent user experience for people with disabilities. So let's take a closer look at these three components: equivalent UX, discriminatory, and people with disabilities. First up, equivalent user experience. Essential for some, useful for all is one way to describe accessibility. To see why, let's look at this diagram showing how accessibility relates to user experience. Accessibility is a subset of usability, which is in turn a component of user experience. And usability is defined as a product can be used to achieve specified goals with effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction in a specified context. The key phrase here is achieve specified goals. Essential for some means there's a barrier to achieving goals for some, and useful for all means lifting that barrier for some benefits everyone. Accessibility, therefore, is usability for people with disabilities. And why this discipline exists is to make sure that people with disabilities are included in the research and solutions for achieving usability. In this image on the left, we have a traditional curb, an approximately 6-inch tall barrier separating pedestrian traffic from the street. On the right, we have a curb cut, which has a cut taken out of the curb in addition to a smooth, gradual ramp between sidewalk and street so they meet at the same level. Curb cuts were originally designed for someone using a wheelchair to have an equivalent experience to someone who can cross a street using their legs. Without curb cuts, crossing a street for someone in a wheelchair would be, if not impossible to do, certainly dangerous to attempt. But as you can see, the person using the curb cut is not in a wheelchair. They are nonchalantly and easily pulling their wheeled suitcase behind them. The curb cut effect is another way of saying essential for some, useful for all. And what can happen over time, which happened with curb cuts, is that they are no longer considered an assistive technology, but a standard we've come to expect and not at all unusual. Next, we'll talk about discriminatory aspects. In 1867 in San Francisco, the first of what are termed ugly laws was passed. It was illegal to be unsightly or a, quote, disgusting object in public. If arrested for this, you would most likely be institutionalized. And these discriminatory attitudes, especially when codified into law, gave rise to the disability rights movement. And the response was to pass anti-discrimination legislation. The most important for our purposes here are the Rehabilitation Act of 1973's Section 508, which applies to federal agencies and its contractors. It mandates WCAG 2.0 Level A as the standard for website, electronic document, and software accessibility. And I'll explain what WCAG is in the next slide. And the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which applies to state and local governments and businesses open to the public. The DOJ, Department of Justice, in March of this year issued guidance for the ADA to use WCAG 2X to ensure websites are accessible. So as promised, web content accessibility guidelines are the best way to measure the accessibility of websites, the best way we have right now. There are 78 success criteria, each having one of three levels, single A, double A, or triple A, which basically goes from most basic to more advanced. There's version 2.1 is the current version, with the others 2.2 and 3 coming in the near future. And success criteria can only be added if they are measurably testable. For example, contrast can be measured using a numeric ratio. So therefore, we can use contrast. WCAG 2.1 AA is the level most websites attempt to achieve. And passing WCAG guidelines doesn't necessarily make your site 100% accessible, given the guidelines don't and can't cover everything. Third, people with disabilities. According to the ADA, disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, a person who has a history or record of such impairment, or a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. For example, for definition 1, if you have cancer, you would be considered disabled. For definition 2, if you've had cancer, you could be denied a promotion if there's a belief that your cancer will return. And for definition 3, if an employer denies you employment because your BMI put you in the obese range, putting you at a higher risk of developing sleep apnea, diabetes, or heart disease, you may not have any of those conditions currently, but are being discriminated against because you have the risk factors for them. So there's a perception that you're disabled and that you may get these things in the future. Who are people with disabilities? You at some point, since you will now or in the future fall into these categories. There are 1 billion people worldwide, or 1 in 6, who have a disability. 1 in 4 Americans report having a disability. People in countries with life expectancies over 70 spend 8 years on average, or 11.5% of their lives, living with disabilities. Permanent disability can happen at any time, and situational and temporary disabilities happen all the time. This is a partial list of mental and physical impairments covered by the ADA. Some very common ones include alcoholism, asthma, back injury, cancer, diabetes, and substance abuse. So many people have these problems. Disabilities that can happen to anyone at any time. For example, if you use a mouse and break your dominant arm, you'll temporarily rely on a keyboard or other alternate input device. Or someone with vision has a device go into low power mode, which dims the screen, making it difficult to see. Sufficient contrast will help them see better. So rest assured, at some point, you will have some type of disability. And that means this is really applying to all of us. And on that note, I will hand this presentation off to Vanessa to share with us how to integrate accessibility into a website using technical examples.
Sure.
So
thank you, Ray.
Take it away as soon as I stop sharing. Sorry, I'm going to do that in 1 second, right there.
Okay, thank you. I'll take the screen. Okay. So I'm going to get into a little bit how people use the web. And I'm gonna, can you guys see my screen? Is it still, okay. Hold on a bit. Let me get to that page. Sorry about this. Okay, so of course there are a plethora of different technologies that are used to access the web visually, of course, using a screen, keyboard and mouse, but there's also other assistive technologies that are illustrated here, such as switches and pointers. And there's also software, text-to-speech and screen readers that make it easy for people with disabilities to use the web. And I will share a short clip on a demonstration about how that technology is used. All right. Okay. All right, I'm having a little bit of trouble with the video, but basically how screen readers work is that some sort of technology is parsing the website
from the University of California, San Francisco's IT Web Services Department. Here today with a brief tour of screen reading technology. I'm a blind person who has been using screen readers.
Okay, sorry about that. But basically the screen reader will parse through each element on the screen, call out what the element is, what the content is, and these types of descriptions and auditory cues kind of clue in someone who's blind or can't actually see the screen, help them navigate it, and help them understand the context around the web page. So it's really important that our sites are mocked up properly so that these cues are communicated clearly to people using assistive technologies. And we'll kind of get more into that as this presentation goes on. So I want to kind of introduce this idea of semantic web. And what that means really is that we are understanding very clearly what the functionality of components that we're bringing into our web experiences, what they are, and what kind of clues that we can take from the analog world, the real world, and apply them to the web. These are understood, these are patterns that have a long usage history and are understood. So if you think about interacting with a button or seeing how data is represented in a table, or how clearly we're communicating states in a switch, it becomes easy to see why it's so important that these recognizable patterns are brought into our web elements and web components. So I would like to get into this idea of HTML and CSS being easy. Of course, they are the building blocks of web development, and it's easy to get content on the screen. But as some of the work that we've done at our clients has kind of illustrated, it can be very easy to abuse and misuse CSS and HTML. There are 113 HTML tags, over 600 CSS properties. So it's very important that we follow guidelines that are documented well to really make sure we're using these elements properly. In fact, 96.8% of home pages have had some sort of WCAG failure. So it's really important that we're properly marking up our pages. Additionally, ARIA, which stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. These are roles and attributes that are used to define ways to make web content accessible. A little bit cynically, the first rule of ARIA is not to use it, which basically means that if there already is a semantic element that exists, we should just use that one as opposed to trying to create some custom implementation of it. And we'll go into this a little more, but for example, using a semantic button over some custom implementation that uses role button. So of course, these elements or these roles and attributes do exist, and it may be necessary sometimes if native HTML doesn't support certain functionality. So we can talk about this in a different lightning talk, but the attribute ARIA labeled by, for example, allows us to associate multiple labels with an interactive element. So these are just some of the ways that ARIA can be used and is helpful. So I'd like for us to get into a relatively simple example, but it is one that often is the foundation of a lot of design systems, and that is buttons and links. So buttons and links are often conflated, but are definitely not the same. So a button implies that an action will take place on the same page, either opening or closing something, or sending a form, or other types of actions that happen in there. But a link actually implies that the URL will change. And this means that the browser will redirect to a new page or a new section within the same page. So when we talk about how to visually represent these types of elements, links, for example, must be distinguishable against static copy. So WCAG has a lot of explicit rules about how to make sure that these elements meet color contrast, of course, against its background, but additionally against the surrounding text as well. So here we have a couple of examples that show different text colors that do technically pass these requirements, but in terms of a usability aspect, we can see how if you have color blindness, how certain colors may not stand out as much or may not be as distinguishable as when we've added an underline here. An underline on a link is a pattern that is very common. It's very easily recognizable. And it does immediately signify that, okay, this is interactive and this is going to go somewhere else. So I'd like for us to take a little bit of time to kind of look at Bootstrap, which is, of course, a very popular library. It's very useful in terms of getting a bunch of classes and styles ready for design systems to be kind of shipped out. But something that has happened and is a little bit inherent in Bootstrap and how it's kind of taken over is just this conflation, this visual conflation between buttons and links, which can cause confusion. Basically, if we have buttons that look like links and links that look like buttons, we really have to make sure that we're able to communicate effectively, like what types of actions are actually being implied. If we have elements that look like each other, someone who's encountering them may not know what to expect if they're acting differently in different contexts in the same system. So if we take a look at some of these code implementations, we can see how the visual conflation of buttons and links can affect the code implementation as well. So these are a couple of paraphrased examples that we've seen in some of the accessibility work that we've done. Divs using on-click events, anchor tags using on-clicks additionally, and buttons that are navigating away to different pages. So these are elements that can cause confusion, specifically when we take a look at using a div that has an on-click to someone using a screen reader. Because a div has no semantic meaning, there's nothing that communicates that it's interactive, and there's nothing even that would communicate that action, either if it's going to go somewhere else or if it's going to do something on the screen. None of that is communicated to those who are using screen readers. So if we further look at these code examples, it is possible for this code to be saved using ARIA, but of course that does further complicate these elements. So as we see here, let's say we're going to turn a div into a button, we would need to apply tab index so that it can be focusable. We would need to apply roll button so that that is communicated to screen readers. And additionally, we would need to apply other JavaScript that makes it clear that it's going to be doing something on the page. Similarly, we would need to do the same thing with anchor tags and buttons. We would need to add all of this supplementary attributes to kind of make it perform the same way as semantic elements, but it does make it more difficult to implement, and it makes it more difficult to test, and also having to have that other layer of making sure that it is going to act the same way that we would expect it to. So of course, if we're going to be using ARIA in this type of way, which we really would not recommend, it must be implemented carefully, and it must really be tested to make sure that we're providing an equitable experience for everyone. So the accessible solution for components like these, if we're designing it so that buttons look like buttons and links look like links, then we can easily just use what is already available in HTML and use a semantic tags. And that automatically ensures all the functionality that is expected. It's communicated properly to anyone using a screen reader, and it keeps the code clean. Okay, so ultimately, why should we care about all of this stuff? From a purely business perspective, it does make sense to ensure that we are compliant. We are minimizing risk of litigation. We're making sure that we're not discriminating against anyone who may encounter any of the products that we are building out. Additionally, of course, it directly affects the bottom line. Why should we exclude any customers that would want to use our products? Why would we inherently just add a barrier that makes it more difficult for someone to use our websites? And of course, internally, we're affecting the maintainability of our systems and experiences. So if we start off with a clean and accessible design, that can easily be translated to clean and accessible code. And that, of course, makes our systems and experiences clear and easy to maintain moving forward. But ultimately, and this is something that I hope that we're effectively communicating, is that accessibility is for everyone. It's not just for quote unquote disabled people. It's not added work or extra work. Of course, there is a business interest in making sure that we are building out accessible experiences. And of course, from an internal team perspective, it's important that we keep all of this easy for us to build. But of course, when we're thinking about our end users, we're considering everyone who could potentially, be affected by how we're building our things out. So that means we're building things responsibly. Not everyone is using a large screen and is able to see all the content at once. That means we're considering colorblind users. We're considering even users who might not be as technically savvy, making sure that we're explaining things clearly and we're using patterns that are easily identifiable. And one more thing that I hope we can communicate as well is that we shouldn't segregate experiences either. We shouldn't have an accessible version versus a regular version. If we really invest in making sure that we are kind of implementing this as early in the process as possible, then we only have to build out one experience that works for everyone. And that, I think, is a pretty valuable point to take note when we're building out our experiences as well. So yeah, that concludes our presentation on an intro to accessibility.